Evangeline Bancroft did not raise her voice. Not when Leopold said it loud enough for the Hargrove ballroom to fall into that particular, horrible silence that only happens when a crowded room, collectively decides to hold its breath. Not when she felt 40 pairs of eyes turn toward her the way they always turn toward something breaking. Not when Claudine Ashby, standing 3 feet behind Leopold's left shoulder, had the decency to look at the floor. She set down her champagne glass. She smoothed the front of her blue silk dress, the one she had chosen that morning with care, not because Leopold noticed such things anymore, but because she represented the Bancroft name tonight, and she had been raised to do things properly or not at all. She curtsied. Low, deliberate, the formal curtsy her mother had made her practice until her knees ached. "As you wish, Mr. Bancroft," she said. Then she walked away. The evening had begun the way most evenings in Boston's merchant circles began in the year 1852, with gaslight flattering the faces of people who had long since run out of important things to worry about, with champagne served before supper, and with the particular undercurrent of tension that Evangeline had learned to read the way a sailor reads weather. She had known before she arrived that Claudine Ashby would be there. She had felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure, a specific tightening behind the eyes that had no name but was always accurate. She had said nothing to Leopold about it. Leopold Bancroft was not a man who welcomed what he called unnecessary anxiety. They had been married 3 years and 2 months. In that time, Evangeline had learned the precise geography of her husband's silences. Which ones meant he was thinking. Which ones meant he had already decided something and was simply waiting for the right moment to say it aloud. She had learned which business associates made his jaw tighten, and which ones he courted with his best version of warmth. She had learned that he took his tea without sugar and his opinions without question, and that the fastest way to end a conversation with Leopold Bancroft was to suggest that someone else might be right. She had learned all of this the way women in her position learned most things. By watching, by listening, by paying the kind of careful attention that nobody ever named or thanked her for. The Hargroves hosted every September. Half of Beacon Hill had turned out, the shipping merchants and their wives, the bank directors, the Carrington daughters looking for suitable matches. Leopold moved through the room separately from Evangeline. That had become usual. In the first year of their marriage, he had kept her close, one hand at the small of her back, making introductions, filling her glass before it emptied. That version of Leopold felt like something she might have imagined. She could barely remember his face from those early months, the almost kind version. The one who had occasionally asked what she thought before he had decided she thought wrong. She was standing near the east windows with a glass of champagne she didn't particularly want, listening to 2 women discuss the new milliner on Tremont Street, when Leopold crossed the room toward her. She saw him coming. For one suspended moment, she felt something flicker, the old feeling, the one from the courtship, when he had looked at her as though she were worth looking at. His jaw was set. She recognized that particular set. The flicker went out. He stopped in front of her. The women discussing the milliner fell silent. Nearby conversations dimmed. People have an instinct for the moment before something breaks. The air changes, and they turn toward it without knowing why. Evangeline. His voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. The room had already gone quiet in the way rooms do when something significant is happening that nobody wants to miss. "Leopold," she said. She held her champagne glass with both hands and looked at him with the expression her mother had called her courthouse face, composed, readable only as calm. "I need to say something," he said, "in front of these people, because I believe these things should be said plainly and without pretense, so there is no confusion afterward." Something cold moved through her, not surprise, more like recognition, the way you recognize a road you've traveled in a dream. "You may say what you need to say," she said. He looked at her for exactly 1 second. In that second, she thought, and she would think about this later, in the quiet of the room she would sleep in alone for the last time. She thought there was something in his expression that might have been hesitation. A single breath where the thing might have gone differently. Then it passed. "This marriage is no longer what I need," Leopold Bancroft said, clearly, in the Hargrove ballroom, in front of 40 people who would each tell 10 more before morning. "I intend to dissolve it. Quietly, and with as little disruption as possible to both parties. But I wanted it said plainly, so that there is no ambiguity going forward." The room did not make a sound. Evangeline heard her own heartbeat. She heard the distant string quartet in the far parlor. still playing, because they hadn't received word that the music was supposed to stop. She heard, very clearly, the sound of a glass being set down somewhere to her left. Careful, deliberate, as though whoever held it had needed to free their hands for whatever came next. She looked at her husband. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about 3 years and 2 months. She thought about the correspondence ledger she had maintained since the first month of their marriage. Every business associate catalogued, every wife's name remembered, every preference noted, so that Leopold never had to ask twice. She thought about the dinners she had planned, and the letters she had written on his behalf when he was traveling, the way she had built, piece by piece, the social architecture that his business ran along. She thought about the Harrington contract, which Leopold had won in part because she had spent 6 weeks cultivating Mrs. Harrington at every charitable committee she could find, and how Leopold had never once asked how the Harringtons had been so easy to win. He had simply assumed the world arranged itself conveniently for men who deserved it. She thought about all the ways she had made herself useful, all the ways she had moved around his moods like water moving around stone. She thought about the one time, the single time. She had said to him, gently, that she sometimes felt she did not know what they were building together, and he had looked at her, as though she had said something in a foreign language he had never studied. She had been wrong about a great many things in this marriage. She had not been wrong about that. Evangeline set her champagne glass on the nearest surface. "As you wish, Mr. Bancroft," she said. Her voice did not shake, it did not rise. It was the voice of a woman who has made a decision so complete that there is nothing left to negotiate. She curtsied, low, deliberate, precise, the formal curtsy appropriate for taking leave of a person of consequence. She gave it to him without irony and without grief. Just the clean, correct thing. Then she walked away. Not quickly. Not the panicked retreat of a woman undone. She walked the way she had been taught to walk in a room full of people who were watching her. Head level, spine straight, each step placed with intention. She passed Mrs. Hargrove near the doorway without looking at her. She passed the Carrington daughters, who had appeared in the hall, with identical expressions of stunned shock. She passed 3 men whose names she could not have told you if her life depended on it. She reached the front entrance. The footman held the door. She thanked him. She always thanked servants. And she walked out into the September night. The air was cool. Boston in early fall always felt like a held breath. She could hear the room behind her resuming its sound. The particular murmur of 40 people who have just witnessed something they cannot quite believe, and are very eager to process. She did not stop walking. Her carriage was waiting at the end of the drive. The driver, a man named Martin who had worked for the Bancroft household for 8 years, and who had always been decent to Evangeline, stood up the moment he saw her coming alone. He said nothing. He held the door. He had enough good sense not to ask where Mr. Bancroft was. She rode back to the Bancroft house in silence. Through the carriage window, the gaslit streets of Beacon Hill passed in amber-lit intervals. She looked at them and thought about something she had read once. That a house without a door you belong to is simply a building. She had spent 3 years and 2 months inside a building, managing it, polishing it, keeping it running like a mechanism that had no interest in whether the hand turning the gears was tired. She was 28 years old. She thought, I am not doing this another day. When the carriage stopped in front of the house, she went directly to her rooms. Luella was already there, half asleep in the chair by the window, the way she never quite managed to stop doing. The old woman was awake and on her feet the moment the door opened. She took one look at Evangeline's face and asked nothing. She simply moved toward the wardrobe. Not those, Evangeline said. We're packing tonight. Luella turned. Her expression shifted through several things quickly. Concern, understanding, and then a steady, practical resolution that Evangeline had always loved about her. How much? What's mine, Evangeline said. Only what was mine before him. That's not much in this house. I know. It won't take long. They worked in near silence for 2 hours. Evangeline was systematic about it. She had always been systematic, even about endings. She took the small watercolor of the Connecticut coast her father had given her before the wedding. She took 3 books with her name written inside the covers. She took her personal correspondence, every letter she had received in 3 years, nothing she had written on Leopold's behalf. She took the correspondence ledger. This last item she did not hesitate over. She had built it. Every entry in it existed because she had made a choice, remembered a name, followed up on a connection that Leopold had been too occupied or too proud to cultivate himself. The ledger was the record of 3 years of invisible work, and it was hers in the only way that mattered. Entirely her creation. She did not take the sapphire earrings Leopold had given her at their first anniversary. She did not take the cashmere wrap from the second winter of their marriage, back when he had still occasionally given her things. She sat at the small writing desk and wrote a letter. 2 drafts. The first had too much in it. The anger was there, solid and justified, and the grief was there too, which surprised her by being more for the woman she had hoped to become in that marriage than for anything Leopold himself had been. In the end, she wrote 6 sentences. She left it on the desk. Luella had organized the trunk with her usual efficiency. 1 trunk, 3 years and 2 months of a life, 1 trunk and a letter in 6 sentences. "Where are we going?" Luella asked. She had made it plain without a single word that wherever it was, she was coming. Evangeline had thought about this on the carriage ride home. She had a friend, Gwendolyn Pell, widowed at 31, who had spent the decade since building a small and remarkably self-sufficient life on the north side of the city. Mrs. Pell had attended Evangeline's wedding and had said afterward, very quietly, "If you ever need a door that opens for you instead of one you have to unlock from the inside, mine is at the corner of Charter and Salem." Evangeline had not known what to do with that at the time. She had been a bride. She had been hopeful. "Mrs. Pell's," she said. Leopold Bancroft did not sleep that night either, though he told himself he would. He told himself that what had happened at the Hargroves was a necessary thing. A decisive action owed to himself after 3 years of a marriage that had never quite become what he had imagined. He told himself Evangeline would be home when he arrived, that she would have needed time to compose herself, that they would speak in the morning, with the careful courtesy they had both mastered. He walked into a dark house. By 6 in the morning, he had given up trying to sleep. He found Mrs. Dowd, the housekeeper, in the corridor, with her hands folded in front of her and an expression he had never seen on her face before. Mrs. Dowd had been in this household for 12 years. She was not a woman given to visible distress. She looked shaken. "Where is Mrs. Bancroft?" he asked. A pause. "Mrs. Bancroft is not in the house, sir." He read the letter 20 minutes later. Her handwriting was the most precise he had ever encountered. Even spaced, unhurried, as though distress had no access to her pen. "Leopold, you said this marriage is no longer what you need. I have accepted your decision. I have taken only what belongs to me. The household accounts are current through the end of the month. Mrs. Dowd has been briefed on the October arrangements. There is nothing left undone. I wish you well. I ask only that you allow me to proceed with my life as I see fit. Evangeline Pemberton." She had signed it with her maiden name. He counted the sentences, 6. He stood with the letter in his hand for a long time, long enough that Mrs. Dowd appeared in the doorway. "The correspondence ledger, sir," she said, with the careful neutrality of a woman who knows the answer, but understands this is information the man in front of her needs to arrive at himself. "The blue one." Mrs. Bancroft kept it. It had all of the— She stopped. "The contacts, sir, all the contacts." The first week was instructional. Day 1. Leopold found himself at supper, with a meal that was technically correct and somehow entirely without the quality that 3 years of suppers had trained him to expect. It took him until he was nearly finished to realize that the kitchen had been quietly supervised every day by his wife, and that nobody had told the cook about the Tuesday delivery arrangement, and that in fact nobody knew about the arrangement with the market at all, because that had been Evangeline's arrangement. Day 2. He needed to write to a business contact, a man named Harrington, regarding a contract renewal. He reached for the blue ledger that always sat on the left side of his desk. It wasn't there. He spent an hour trying to reconstruct the Harrington connection from memory, and produced something that felt, when he read it back, like a man guessing at a language he had never formally studied. Day 3. He heard from his business partner Aldrich that there was talk in the merchant circles. "What kind of talk?" Leopold said. Aldrich looked at his hat. "The kind that mentions Mrs. Bancroft's name respectfully, and yours considerably less so." Day 4. He sat in his study and tried to reconstruct the correspondence ledger from memory. He got perhaps 40 names, before he realized he could not remember the names of their wives, which was exactly the kind of detail that had smoothed every difficult introduction and softened every awkward dinner for 3 years. He had not known he was relying on it. He had not known someone was providing it every single day without being asked or thanked. He sat with the 40 names and thought about what it had taken to compile the full version. The patience, the attention, the specific kind of labor that looks, from a distance, like effortlessness. He had mistaken it for effortlessness. Day 5 he went to call on Claudine Ashby. It did not go the way he had expected. Claudine received him with the precise warmth of a woman who is recalculating. She had come from old Boston money, which meant she had been raised to read rooms and adjust accordingly. And the room she was reading now told her something she did not like. She asked, with the gentle indirectness of the socially skilled, about the Harrington renewal, about the Whitmore dinner in October, about whether the merchant committee still met at the Parker House on Thursdays. Leopold answered 3 of these questions incorrectly, because the answers had always lived in a blue ledger that was currently sitting on a desk he had never visited. Claudine did not say anything unkind. She simply became, perceptibly, without drama, a degree less warm. And then a degree less warm again. And then, on the walk to his carriage, something in her face settled into the particular expression of a woman who has done a calculation and found the result disappointing. He drove home through streets he had lived in his entire adult life and felt, for the first time, that he did not quite know how they worked. Mrs. Gwendolen Pell received Evangeline without performance. She opened the door herself at 3:30 in the morning, looked at Evangeline's face, looked at the single trunk Martin was setting down on the front step, and said, "Come in, there's tea." That was all. In the days that followed, Evangeline discovered what it was to be useful in ways that were entirely her own. Miss Pell ran a small consulting practice from her parlor. She had built it over the decade, since her husband's death, advising merchant families on social correspondence, introductions, and the careful business of reputation management in a city where the right name said in the right room could open a contract, and the wrong one could close 3. It was, Evangeline realized on her 3rd morning there, exactly what she had been doing inside the Bancroft household for 3 years. Only there, nobody had called it a practice. Nobody had called it anything at all. "You could do this," Mrs. Pell said on an afternoon, when they were working through correspondence for one of her clients. She said it simply, without persuasion, the way you state something that has been obvious for a while. Evangeline looked at the letter she was drafting. "I have been doing it," she said. "For someone else's name," Mrs. Pell said. "That's a different thing entirely." The letter from Leopold arrived on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after she had left. She read it at Mrs. Pell's kitchen table, while her host made coffee and practiced the particular tact of looking elsewhere. It was longer than she expected. More careful in some ways, which meant he had written it more than once. He had made inquiries, he said, about Claudine Ashby, about the nature of his reasoning, about what he had been told and by whom, and about what he had allowed himself to want to believe. He had confirmed, speaking to 2 separate people, that Claudine had suggested the marriage was not a good match in ways that served her own purposes. He was not writing to excuse himself, he said. He understood the error was his. He said he missed her. She read that line twice. She sat with it for the length of time it took her to drink half a cup of coffee. Then she folded the letter, put it in the small tin box where she kept her correspondence, closed the lid, and went back to the draft she had been working on for Mrs. Pell's Thursday client. She had work to do. What she had not anticipated was the city finding its way to her door. Mrs. Harrington called first on a Wednesday afternoon. She came with a tin of biscuits and the expression of a woman who has come to say something she has rehearsed. "I heard what happened," she said, once they were sitting with tea and Mrs. Pell had disappeared with her usual perfect timing. "I want you to know that not everyone in this city is taking the convenient version as truth." "What is the convenient version?" Evangeline asked. Mrs. Harrington looked uncomfortable in the specific way of a woman who does not wish to be the messenger, but has decided she must be. "That you were difficult, that the marriage suffered because of your management of the household, that Mr. Bancroft is to be pitied." A pause. "That there were reasons not stated publicly." The room was very still. "I see," Evangeline said. Her voice was even. "I know Claudine Ashby," Mrs. Harrington said. "I know how she says things. I know how useful it is to say them quietly, with concern, to the right people." She looked at Evangeline directly. "I thought you should know she is saying them." After Mrs. Harrington left, Evangeline sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She thought about 3 years of keeping her own counsel. 3 years of moving carefully, of saying the managed version of things instead of the true version, of staying small and correct and above reproach. done it because she believed that being beyond criticism was the same as being safe. She was looking at that belief now in the clear light of what it had failed to protect her from. She picked up her pen. She wrote a letter that evening, not to Leopold, but to Aldrich, her husband's business partner, the one person in that circle she believed would receive her honestly. She stated facts. She made no claims she could not support. She asked for nothing except that he hear her, and that he be willing to say what he actually knew if someone asked. She sealed it and addressed it in her precise, unhurried hand. She gave it to Martin in the morning. He took it without comment. He had been appearing at Mrs. Pell's door every day for a week without instruction, because he had driven Evangeline out of that house at midnight, and had apparently decided that his conscience required him to remain available to her. She had not told him to come, he had simply come. He was, she thought, a better man than his employer had known to notice. Aldrich came to see Leopold on a Friday that Leopold had not anticipated. He sat across from him in the study and said, with the directness of a man who has decided that indirectness is costing him more than it is worth, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need an honest answer, because there is a great deal hinging on it that you may not be aware of." "Ask," Leopold said. "How much of your social network did your wife build?" The silence stretched. "More than I accounted for," Leopold said finally. Aldrich nodded. "I've been making calls this week. The Harrington renewal. Harrington told me, when I asked directly, that his wife had advocated strongly for the contract, that she trusted Mrs. Bancroft's judgment implicitly, and that trust had extended to you by association." He paused. "When I told him Mrs. Bancroft was no longer in the picture, he asked whether the October dinner was still happening." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd inquire." Aldrich looked at him steadily. "I'm inquiring." Leopold sat with his hands flat on the desk. He thought about the blue ledger. He thought about the letter in 6 sentences. He thought about the cashmere wrap still hanging on the hook in his wife's rooms. Exactly where she had left it. The one thing of his giving that she had chosen not to take. He had passed that room 3 times in 2 weeks. He had not moved it. "She built it," Aldrich said quietly, when the silence had stretched long enough. "All of it. I'd imagine she considered the ledger hers." Leopold said nothing. He was thinking, with the slow and deeply unwelcome clarity of a man watching a building start to show its cracks, that his household had not run itself. That his business had not maintained its relationships through his own charm and merit alone. That a woman with a systematic mind and an apparently inexhaustible capacity for unacknowledged work had been standing behind every smooth introduction and every well-timed letter for 3 years. And that he had looked directly at her every day and seen, somehow, nothing but furniture. He was seeing it now. He was seeing it because she was gone. The second letter from Leopold was longer and less composed than the first. He had spoken to Aldrich, he said. He had spoken to Mrs. Harrington, who had been unexpectedly direct with him. He had taken a hard look, he wrote, at the shape of his own error. Not only the night at the Hargroves, but the 3 years before it, the specific habit of receiving what she built and attributing it to circumstance. He said he would like to see her, if she was willing. Evangeline read it at the desk that Mrs. Pell had cleared for her in the front parlor, the desk where, in the past 2 weeks, she had completed 3 correspondence reviews, drafted 7 letters for clients, and begun the careful work of building a list of her own. Names she knew, connections she had made, the detailed record of 3 years of labor that had been invisible to everyone but her. The correspondence ledger sat open on the corner of the desk. She folded Leopold's letter and put it in the tin box with the first one. Then she looked out the window at Charter Street and thought about what she actually wanted. Not what was reasonable, not what would restore the appearance of normalcy to the story the city was telling about her. What she, Evangeline Pemberton, wanted for her own life. She wanted her name to mean something that was entirely her own. She wanted the work she was good at to live under that name, not someone else's. She wanted to walk into a room and be seen as a person who had built something, not as a wife who had failed to hold something together. She wrote back, not an agreement to see him, an honest response, line by line, without softening. She told him she had been silent for 3 years in ways that had cost her, that she had kept her observations to herself, because she had believed silence was safer than speaking, and she had been wrong, that she did not hold him responsible for all of it, that a silence she had chosen was still a silence she had chosen, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She told him she did not know yet what the future held, and that she needed time to find out, and that she was not willing to shortcut that process for the convenience of a cleaner story. She sealed the letter. She addressed it in her own hand. She felt, as she handed it to Martin, something settle in her that had not been settled in a very long time. Not relief exactly, but the specific solid feeling of a woman who has said the actual truth in actual sentences, and will not be walking any of it back. 6 weeks after the night at the Hargroves, Evangeline Pemberton opened a small office on the second floor of a building on Washington Street. The brass plate beside the door read, E. Pemberton, Social Correspondence and Introductions. Mrs. Pell had helped her draft the announcement. Martin had carried the boxes. Luella had organized the supply cabinet, with a system she did not explain to anyone, which was simply how Luella operated. Mrs. Harrington had sent a note to 4 women of her acquaintance, each of whom sent their own notes to 3 more. By the end of the first week, Evangeline had 5 clients. Leopold's third letter arrived on a Thursday, addressed to the office. She read it at her desk during the hour between her second and third appointments. He had spoken to more people, he said. He had found that the story being told about her in the city was being replaced one conversation at a time by a more accurate one. Partly through his own efforts, partly through Mrs. Harrington's. He said the Harrington contract had been renewed. He credited her for the architecture that had made it possible. He said he missed her again, without elaboration. She set the letter down. She sat with it for the length of time it took her to finish her coffee. She felt something. The specific, complicated feeling of a person reading a letter that is honest and still not enough at the same time. Not enough to reconstruct what had been. Not enough to make her want to go back to a version of herself that had been careful and useful and invisible for 3 years, and had received this in return. She placed the letter in the tin box with the first 2, closed the lid, and put it in the bottom drawer of her desk. She locked the drawer. Her third appointment arrived at 2:30. A Mrs. Caldwell, newly arrived in Boston from Philadelphia, whose husband had merchant ambitions and no existing connections in the city. She was 24 years old, sharp-eyed, and clearly accustomed to being underestimated. Evangeline stood and held out her hand. Mrs. Caldwell, she said, come in. Let's talk about what you need. Mrs. Caldwell sat down. She looked around the office, the organized shelves, the ledger open on the desk, the brass plate visible through the window, catching the October light, with the expression of a woman encountering something she had been looking for, without knowing what to call it. I heard about you from Mrs. Harrington, she said. She said you were the best in the city. Mrs. Harrington is kind, Evangeline said. She also said you're the only one doing this under her own name. Mrs. Caldwell looked at her directly. She meant it as a compliment. Evangeline picked up her pen. Tell me about your husband's business, she said, and then tell me about yours. Outside on Washington Street, the October afternoon moved along its ordinary way. Carriages, pedestrians, the smell of wood smoke threading through the air as the city settled into fall. The brass plate on the second floor caught the light and held it, steady and unhurried, the way a thing holds the light when it has been put exactly where it belongs. The name on it was not borrowed. It was not inherited. It had not been handed to her by someone else's ambition or protected by someone else's standing. It was simply hers, earned at considerable cost, placed on a door that opened from the inside, in a building she had chosen for herself, in a city that was already, one conversation at a time, beginning to understand exactly what it had in her. She was 28 years old, and she was just beginning.